What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero, because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Friday, June 16th, 2017. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. And, of course, the lovely Lady Claire will be joining us in hour number 3 of our program today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, ready to answer the phone and put you on the air with your comments and questions. Next Tuesday, of course, on the 20th, Dr. Renee Default will be our on-air guest talking about the problems with mercury and high fructose corn syrup, and apparently a little bit of a disagreement she had over that matter with the Food and Drug Administration. Now, we are continuing to see the fallout from the tragic shooting of the GOP baseball team, and it is painting a portrait of America that, frankly, in some areas is not very flattering at all. And what is alarming is how many liberals are out there trying to fan this along, saying it's a good thing. And amazingly enough, over at the Huffington Post, writer Jesse Ben basically came on out and said it's time to organize the violent resistance following the shooting of the congressman. This is way over the top. It's incitement to violence. And again, I'm disappointed in Trump on many areas. Okay, but we're supposed to be a civil society. And obviously civility is breaking down. And with it, our civilization as a whole. Apparently, some GOP people are getting hate mail. It's just this ongoing campaign by the liberal snowflakes out there. The other day, right after the shooting, we were talking about how liberals were going on Twitter with all these hateful comments about, you know, see, you should have voted for gun control, and you should have done this, and you should have done that. And now there are people out there trying to claim that Scalise was targeted because of involvement with Pedogate, and everybody's just out there pounding this thing for their particular agenda. But even today, despite the backlash, despite the embarrassing revelation that the shooter was himself a Democrat, a Bernie Sanders supporter, they're still out there saying this was a good thing, and it's I'm disgusted. I'm disgusted by this behavior. I really, really am. Now, Nancy Pelosi, who has occasionally given us reason to think she's lost her reality license, was up there making a speech to Congress and actually said that Scalise had died. And then she realized she made a goof and hides it by fake coughing fit. And is she just really that senile, or was she having her BBC World Trade Center 7 has collapsed moment? A lot of people are very concerned that Scalise is in the exact same hospital where Seth Rich strangely died, despite very, very minor gun wounds. Now, a lot of people were asking, how did Hodgkinson know where to go for this practice? And I'd speculated that there was probably some kind of a bulletin board over the Capitol building. Turns out it wasn't that difficult. Apparently, the New York Times actually ran a story saying the GOP members of the House are going to be over at this baseball park in Alexandria with a practice session for the charity game. And so, yeah, it's amazing here. Now, in a more general sense, we've reached the point where this so-called resist movement and its associated violence are starting to tear America apart. And maybe that's their goal, or maybe they just don't care. Maybe Hillary's attitude is, if I can't be the president, there's not going to be a United States of America any longer. But they're out there, they're demonstrating, they're causing property damage. And the spearhead of that is this loosely formed, for lack of a better word, terrorist group called Antifa. Now, Antifa claims that their name is short for anti-fascist, And, of course, the irony of that is that all of their tactics are straight from the fascist playbook. And apparently somebody has found an Antifa training manual on how to go on out and harm their targets, which includes a section on how to hide sharp objects inside pet treats and scatter them in the area where their targets are going to walk the dogs to kill their pets. As Ron White would say, you have to be a real manly man to go after the puppies and kittens. Now, Oliver Stone is in the news right now a lot because of, first of all, his interviews with Vladimir Putin, and second of all, because of his little head-to-head with Stephen Colbert. And it's a shame CBS cut that out because Oliver Stone did make a very valid point. Everyone's screaming about Russia trying to influence American politics, but Israel just does it all the time. But you're not supposed to talk about that. Anyway, we're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. And so Oliver Stone was on Tucker Carlson tonight, last night, and basically saying that the deep state and the military-industrial complex and the intelligence agencies are all trying to shape policy with leaks. And that does seem to have some merit because it is coming on out that James Comey leaked more than just that one memo to the New York Times. In fact, it may turn out he was one of the major, if not the major leaker, trying to get information into the media in order to shape policy. And certainly the goal of that leak to the New York Times by Comey was to get Attorney General Jeff Sessions to recuse himself from the Russian investigation so that they could put in this political hack, Robert Mueller, to do a hatchet job on the president. Stone went on to say that he's absolutely shocked at how the CIA is treating Trump right now. He shouldn't be too surprised because, of course, he made a very excellent movie about how the CIA was treating John F. Kennedy. But the reality is Special Prosecutor Mueller is a political hack. And again, going on back to just after 9/11, when Mueller was head of the FBI, he was part and parcel of that attempt to frame innocent people for the anthrax letters. When those anthrax letters first showed up, they were written to make it look like they were from semi-literate Muslims. But it turned out the anthrax contained in them was our own stuff from U.S. military biological weapons laboratories. And they went after Stephen Hatfield, and they made his life, they ruined his life. He sued for almost $5 million. And then they jumped to somebody else. They went to Bruce Ivins, who they just basically wrecked his life. They destroyed him. And this was all done by Mueller with James Comey as his assistant. And again, as I mentioned yesterday, there was actually a real suspect in that case, Dr. Philip Zack, who had been fired from that same laboratory where the biological weapon form of anthrax was being stored, the exact same strain, over a racially motivated attack against an Egyptian co-worker. And the security system showed Philip Zack, who apparently had not surrendered his little cards or anything, going into that lab where that anthrax was being stored. And nobody investigated him. Nobody talked to him. Oh, it was, we're going to drain this lake over here. We're sure he threw his anthrax mixing stuff in there. I mean, it was just an absolute ridiculous dog and pony show. They were trying to frame innocent people and protect somebody who very clearly indications were that he was guilty. And that's not what we're supposed to be getting from the FBI, if you believe all those wonderful TV shows and movies, which we don't. Now, attention from all this Russia investigation is now focusing on Loretta Lynch, and Donald Trump took the gloves off earlier this week and basically accused former Attorney General Loretta Lynch of illegally giving Hillary Clinton protection during the investigation into the Democrat presidential nominee's private email server. And I'm glad Trump did it. Now, going out and doing it on Twitter, it's beginning to look a little petty and vindictive. But Trump is the president, and he does have certain powers and authorities. And he's got to go on the offensive here. He's been playing defensive rope-a-dope for way too long. And the opposition is not tiring out. Even though there is no evidence of this Russia collusion, now they're trying to shift it to obstruction. They're not going to stop until he is gone. He has got to fight back. And the best way to fight back is to go right at the heart of that narcocracy. Loretta Lynch, Hillary Clinton, and even former FBI Director James Comey, who was, after all, a director at HSBC when they were caught laundering all that drug money. Trump needs to get aggressive. He's got to regain the initiative right now. The time for being polite is over. This battle is not going to be won on Twitter. It's going to be won in the courtrooms. And he's got to move forward on this. All right, we're going to take a phone call. Mark in North Carolina. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike? Mike, I don't know if I ever told you. Before I was, most of my adult life, I've been in some kind of law enforcement. I was a court officer in New York, of course, and a correctional officer in Texas. And when I was a court officer, that's kind of similar to the Capitol Police. When you had a bunch of judges get together or something like that, they would have a number of us there for protection. We didn't have, they didn't have personal protection all the time unless they were threatened. And they had what you call the judicial escort team. But other than that, if there was like a bunch of them got together, they'd have a bunch of us there for protection.
Well, there were Capitol Police at that baseball diamond.
Only two, and that's for one guy. That was the Scalise, because he was a special. He was not just a congressman. He was like a majority whip or something like that.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, these geniuses who, with their huge security state and surveillance state, and what you got to go through when you go through the airport and all this other crap, they should have known. There should be some kind of, when you got this many congressmen and senators getting together in one place, there should be at least 10 officers to watch them. And they should even have, other than just pistols, they should have like shotguns or semi-automatic rifles or something like that. Because you never know.
I agree.
Especially, they always think.
I absolutely agree with you. They were left unprotected. And again, I think the New York Times showed a serious lack of judgment in running the story, saying where they were going to be. And again, getting on back to this total surveillance state we're all supposed to be living in, looking at Hodgkinson's Facebook page, it was obvious this guy had some serious issues. If anybody was going to be on a watch list, it should have been this guy. But he wasn't. And to me, it suggests that all of this total information awareness and NSA scanning and everything, like anything else produced by the United States government, it's a huge waste of time and money and doesn't actually work.
It's only meant to harass us and to watch us. It's not meant for anything else. This guy, by the way, the fact that, I'm beginning to believe now, this wasn't a false flag, but this was an assassination attempt, and I'm beginning to believe somebody on the left was behind this, very possibly the DNC, the same people that murdered
No. Look at what has happened here. This has been a PR disaster for the liberals and the Democrats. And what's amazing is they don't seem to realize it. And they're still out there on Twitter making all these hateful comments. If whoever's supposed to be advising them on public relations ought to tell them, you got to cool it right now. This is a PR disaster for the Democrats. And so, no, I don't think anybody on the left was behind this. I think the guy really was a lone wolf.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is, here he goes. He moves from Belleville, Illinois. I'm not sure where Belleville is, but I'm sure the cost of living is a lot lower than it is in Washington, D.C. And out of nowhere, the guy decides to move to Washington and lives out of his van.
Yeah.
It just seems very odd to me. It just seems like, this was kind of planned. It's like these people are not very smart. Like if it was the DNC behind it, instead of hiring a professional, they hired an idiot who didn't even know how to shoot right.
No.
And actually, the reason they finally were able to gun him down is because he actually, while he was reloading, he gets up while he's reloading and starts walking around. And that was it for him. A professional would have probably killed the 2 cops first, and then had a field day killing these senators and congressmen.
I agree with you, which is again why I don't think this guy was hired to do this, because he was so bad at it. But let me finish here for a second. First of all, apparently when he moved to Washington in March, he told his I guess they were in the middle of a divorce, his wife, that he was going to go to Washington, D.C. to work on tax reform. And again, this is consistent with some photos that have surfaced of him where, you know, he's talking about how you need to tax the rich and not the poor and the rest of that. But again, this is a disaster for the Democrats and the liberals. In fact, I got an email from somebody saying that Donald Trump did this just to make the Democrats look bad, which I think is an equally silly idea. But again, the fact that this guy was so inept, and all those people who survived the shooting there ought to be grateful for it. The fact that he was so inept, it doesn't look like a put-up job. You want somebody who's going to be able to go in there and hit the designated target. And it looked like this guy was just firing into the crowd. And what's interesting is apparently before he left for Washington, D.C., there have been noise complaints by his neighbors because he was out back target shooting and practicing with that SKS.
But what I wanted to point out is that the murder of Seth Rich does not sound to me like it was a professional job. It just seems like it was covered up. Because first of all, he survived. They didn't evidently use a very high-powered weapon. There might have even been some kind of a struggle. He actually, from what I understand, he should have survived when he got to the hospital. And it sounds to me like if anybody killed him, it might have been the Washington, D.C. police, because everything was closed up when they got there. So, and everything was covered up. But it was not it doesn't sound to me like it was a professional job in the first place. And the DNC, I'm sure, put whoever did it up there. And now I've seen Anonymous on YouTube, and Anonymous is saying that there were 3 individuals that were caught after this. 3 young, sounds like fairly young kids.
What do you mean by after this? What do you mean by after this?
No, after the shooting.
Which one? You're blending 2 shootings together.
I'm sorry, the Seth Rich.
Okay, all right, good. Thank you.
Okay. There were three people caught, and then they were let go. Then for some reason, they just disappeared from federal records. They were caught, they said, by federal police, I assume the FBI. Okay? And then their records just disappeared. This comes from Anonymous.
Let me have a few moments here. Remember the Columbine shooting, and they arrested arrested 3 other people besides the 2 kids who supposedly committed suicide in the school. You know, they do sometimes these hits get done very, very badly. I can think of no better example than the fact that when they suicided Vince Foster, he had 2 bullet wounds on him, that they had to cover up one of those, and they didn't even do that very well. The fact is that these people who work for the Clintons, they're not always very, very good. But again, to me, it's obvious Seth Rich was a hit, an assassination for being the DNC leaker. But this situation with James, James Hodgkinson, my instincts are saying he really was a lone wolf. The guy had issues, and you're talking about him standing up while he's reloading is another reason why I want to know if this guy was on prescription antidepressants.
Oh, that's certainly possible. I mean, I'm not saying I think this for sure. It's just, at first, when this happened, I said, yeah, this sounds like just some nutcase. But then when I started looking at the fact that he, moves from Illinois to Washington, lives out of his car, did have some experience shooting guns, evidently he had this weapon before, then I started thinking of Seth Rich, and I said, you know what? Whoever hires these guys, they don't hire the best. They don't hire a real professional hitman. And I started thinking of the Seth Rich case, the fact that he actually survived the shooting and they killed him in the hospital.
Okay,
so
Mark.
That's why I'm saying.
Mark.
Yeah.
Okay, when somebody is hired to do a shooting, their ultimate goal is to get away with it and escape, like those 3 gentlemen who vanished after the Seth Rich hit. This guy apparently didn't seem to care if he was going to live or die. And that's another reason why. Was he on medication? Was he suicidal? Anyway, Mark, got to let you go for a commercial. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to take another phone call. Alex in Texas, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike, happy weekend for everybody that's listening. I wanted to say that because you just, I'm an experienced person that went through the war, very young, but I went through the Salvadoran Civil War, and all the writing's on the wall, Mike. It's right there. I mean, it's sad because we were all, helping you work so that this doesn't happen. We could avoid World War III, but I think if we can avoid World War III, the war is going to come here, and unfortunately, the situation and tensions are so exacerbated, and people are just full of intransigence, both on the left and the right. The left is very vengeful, and the right is very upset that they've had to be putting up with all this nonsense and outright shenanigans, and they just don't have any more patience for it. I mean, there was an article I read a long time ago that said that deplorables had the longest fuse, but it is, however, a fuse. And some of these guys, they're just itching to do things that will end certain things, that will bring forward some other things that we just don't want them. And we especially someone that's lived through it and has seen it. I mean, the only thing that hasn't happened yet is our currency hasn't been devalued. But as soon as that, I mean, that's around the corner.
Well, our currency has been in a gradual state of devaluation for going on the last 100 years.
Yeah, but the bubbles are keeping it up.
Yeah, but it looks like all the bubbles are bubbling at the same time, and when they pop, there's going to be a major upset. Obviously, I understand what you're saying, and sadly, I agree with pretty much all of it. I certainly do not want to see violence in the streets of America. I do not want to see a civil war. I do not want to see a national emergency and martial law. And unfortunately, especially over on the liberal side, these people are caught up in their dream world of how they think the country ought to be. They're not thinking long term what the consequences of their actions could lead to. And it's certainly not the world that they imagine they want to live in. But right now they're caught up in the moment. They're encouraged to think only in the immediate here and now. In fact, as the society as a whole is all about 30 and 60-second sound bites. And most people don't really look at what they're doing and say, how's this going to affect things 5 years down the road? And that has been a real problem with our U.S. government as well, that goes on out and does these things like the oil price war against Russia, and they didn't consider how it might backfire. They went into Afghanistan and apparently didn't consider that we might still be there 15 years later.
Mike, there's one big difference that I find with the folks that are awake and the folks that are fighting being awake, and that's just fear. It's just fear. You either love your brother that you've been here in this country fighting and struggling with the narcocracies, or you want to kill them. And unfortunately, there's these people are just so engulfed in fear because of the system that once held this country together is no more. But it's like these people don't want to accept that it hasn't been. Like you have some of these like workhorse patriots that they pretend that all we have to do is follow the Constitution. They have no idea that the Constitution has been usurped with technology.
Well, no, first of all, I have to cut you off because we're at a commercial break here. No, the problem is there are people who think the Constitution should be the guideline for the country, but too much of the country, including the government itself, doesn't agree. They want to turn this nation into something else, a liberal paradise, or the reality is a fascist dictatorship. Alex, we got to let you go. Got to take another break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha America, welcome back to the show here, and backing up to the shooting because people are still talking about it here. Somebody's actually put together a map using the fusion function in Google Maps, and there's a link to it now on the main page of whatreallyhappened.com. And it shows reported instances of violence against Trump supporters. And it's all over the country, mostly along the coastlines. We've even had an incident out here where a Trump supporter's home was vandalized. Minor, but still it shows what's going on. What is really troubling, though, apparently a Democratic strategist, James Devine, is out there tweeting under the hashtag Hunt Republican Congressman. And his tweet is, "We are in a war with selfish, foolish, and narcissistic rich people. Why is it a shock when things turn violent?" Well, Mr. Devine, I would like to remind you that when it comes to narcissistic rich people, most of those are in the film industry, and they overwhelmingly are Democrats. And I would like to remind Mr. Devine and everybody else that there are a lot of Republicans in this country who are not rich, who are not narcissistic. And if you look at some of those crybaby snowflake liberals who were just unable to control their tears when Hillary lost, do you really think you stand a chance at winning an actual civil war when it comes down to it? I think it would be very, very stupid for you to try. All right, a couple of news stories, then we're going to go back to the phones here. We were talking about how this Russia probe has exposed Loretta Lynch for possible wrongdoing in the Clinton email case. I mean, there's a much stronger case against Loretta Lynch for obstruction than there is against Donald Trump. In fact, there doesn't really seem to be a case for obstruction against Donald Trump. You can't get an obstruction charge out of the FBI director saying, well, I felt uncomfortable. Because remember, Comey testified under oath. He was never told to alter any of the investigations. It would take an overt act like that to constitute obstruction of justice. Another article that's coming out of the Daily News is saying Loretta Lynch should be called to testify about her direction to then FBI Director James Comey to refer to the email case as a matter and to avoid using the word investigation. Now, Mike Pence has hired his own outside attorney for this coming Russia probe. And now Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is acknowledging that he may recuse himself from the Russia probe because he's probably going to be called as a witness as well. But it's not a Russia probe anymore. They're shifting it over to obstruction. And Trump is understandably upset. He's being investigated for firing the FBI director by the man who told him to fire the FBI director. And here's where it gets interesting. Mueller's on a fishing expedition. We can't get anything with Russia. Let's go for obstruction. There's a small problem. The statute that allows the appointment of a special counsel says you have to have a specific articulation of a crime. You can't just have a special counsel and say, go find something. There's a special counsel to investigate the White House tapes, to go back to Nixon. A special counsel to investigate the Russia collusion thing. And he's supposed to stay with that. He's not allowed to just say, I'm expanding the probe to find out if Donald Trump is gay and sexually harassing the FBI director. It's ridiculous. But it's actually illegal for Mueller to go outside the original specific articulation of a crime. All right, let's take some phone calls. Brendan in San Francisco, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, you're on fire today. What a great show.
Thank you.
I think that we're basically at a point that the caller from Central America was just on point for the most part. And I think where we're at is Americans that have been here, the second generation, et cetera, we're really not needed. We're kind of the middle class that knows or expects certain rights. And it's better to just get rid of us and bring in a new breed of folks that will accept less and to pit all these different groups against each other. Don't bring people in that have patriotic leanings. Bring people in that are just here to make a buck and send money home, etc. And an example of that is Obama, a nation, was not allowing Christians in from Syria. That is proof positive. They don't want Christians. A second evidence is Cubans tend to vote Republican, and now they are not welcome here.
Yes.
So the divide and conquer strategy is well on its way, and the sad part is these folks that are the useful idiots that won't even take a step back and try to see how they're being used and manipulated. And that's my big struggle, is trying to reach these folks. I don't know if it's the water or the flicker rates again, but we got to reach out to these folks that are at least on the fence and try to reach them. And Trump needs to activate maybe the Oath Keepers or the National Guard to show that we do have laws and order here, because things are getting out of hand. And this is really our ninth inning or fourth quarter. I mean, we have to start mobilizing and stop this ridiculous psyop on Trump. What are your thoughts?
Well, one thing that is very troubling to me is we're seeing all of these politicians and various groups openly violating existing U.S. law, and I'm wondering, why aren't they being prosecuted? Why are not the governors of these states that are defying federal immigration law and providing sanctuary to these illegal immigrants, why are they not being arrested and charged? It almost seems like this idea of a two-tier society where the laws only apply to us poor people down here, and once you're a mayor or a governor or whatever, that you can just do whatever you want. We were talking earlier about this writer over at the Huffington Post who's saying it's time to organize the violence against conservatives. That's incitement to violence. That's a crime. And it just seems, that's why I'm saying Trump needs to go on the offensive. He needs to regain the initiative. It's time for him to get aggressive. He just can't stand there and be a punching bag for these people like he has been up until now. He's got to turn the tables on him. He's got to go after Loretta Lynch. He's got to go after Hillary Clinton, and for no other reason than it would underscore the fact that there has been a double standard where these people were allowed to get away with serious felony crimes while the entire media establishment is out there trying to just make up stuff about Donald Trump and prostitutes in Mexico, the Russia collusion that went nowhere, the Russia hacking the DNC email server. It's time for Trump to actually take off the gloves and maybe put on some presidential brass knuckles. Boy, there's a product idea.
Yeah. I think it's the Oath Keepers, the National Guard. We need to be on alert. We need to be ready to act to suppress any kind of mob rule. And that's where we're heading. And we know that's what they want. They want society. The social contract's been broken, and everyone wants their slice of the pie. It's like they're gonna be promised, go take that mansion off the hill. If you can get it, it's going to be yours. I mean, I just see things spinning out of control, and it's going to, once it happens, it's going to be exponentially. One thing I want to mention, they're trying to compile a list. Cernovich is suggesting we get all the tweets that are kill Trump and act on that legally.
I agree.
Cannot call for the assassination of the president and get away with it. That's a really good starting point to push back. And once again, legal, lawful, rule, we can't let this thing spin out of control. And that's what they're trying to do. I can see it.
Well,
thanks, Mike.
I think a big part of thank you for the phone call. I think a big part of the problem is that for too long, these people who are out there screaming, kill or hunt Republican congressmen and all the rest of it, nothing has happened to them. And it's like having a spoiled child. They do something bad, you just laugh it off. They're going to do something bad again, and it's going to get worse and worse over time. And unfortunately, the liberal snowflakes they're acting like a bunch of really spoiled children, and now they're getting into this Antifa situation where they're out there committing violent acts, and so far nobody seems to want to like slap them down and say it's time to grow up and be adults, and be citizens of the United States of America. And there are certain expected standards of behavior that go with that, which is that you're not out there threatening politicians you don't agree with. You engage them in debate, and you certainly don't go on out and just haul off and start shooting them. That's not the United States of America that was intended to be. And I understand that a lot of what the United States was intended to be has already been taken away from us by the corruption in the central government and the machinations of the CIA and so forth. But I am not ready to say that I'm supporting any kind of a violent resolution. I'm still convinced that we're headed for a Soviet Union-style collapse, and we all need to stay calm and sit back and just let it happen. And one of the aspects of that is going to be that those of us who work for a living and are self-sufficient and taking care of ourselves are going to get through this transition. And all of those liberals out there who are expecting the government to buy them everything, they're going to be in serious, serious trouble. All right, let's take a phone call from Dustin in New Jersey. Dustin, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. How you doing?
Doing okay.
Yeah, your last caller is absolutely right. Typical divide and conquer. Been seen through history before, and they use the media as the linchpin to start people. That guy was just a nut, but they use the media and they get people riled up. And there's always going to be a percentage of people that they'll use as their foot soldiers, to go out and do harm. And I have to definitely second the motion again. We're headed towards something because this can't continue. The rhetoric is still coming out. It's only been a day, and there's it's going to be back to business as normal, just the rhetoric, the garbage. It's the globalist deep state versus Trump and his supporters, and and it seems like they just want to dispose of us if we get in their way now. That's what it's coming down to.
It is a very ugly situation, and one of the earlier callers did make a valid point that there may be an agenda to sort of dispose of American citizens who have come to expect a certain standard of living by living and working in the United States, and just blanket replace them with a new labor force that will be happier with much less. And it sounds
like in Europe.
Yeah, like they're doing it in Europe as well.
Hey, Mike, real quick, I just want to mention, you'll probably talk about this, the possible killing of al-Baghdadi, which we heard this before, but 30 commanders and 300 ISIS fighters from Saudi Arabia and the U.S. have been killed by the Russians in May. I just want to let people know that.
Well,
thanks, Mike.
Okay, apparently the U.S. is now confirming that Russia did get al-Baghdadi. So, he was one of the two big boogeymen used to sell us on the necessity for war. So, my, oh my, what is the United States government going to do now? They're going to have to invent a whole new supervillain, for us to all hate and fear, and so forth and so on. It's one of the things I liked about the third Iron Man movie, where Ben Kingsley played this drug addict actor who was playing this horrible terrorist. And then when Iron Man finally meets him, he says, it's complicated. It's complicated. Yeah, I'm just an actor, really. And again, going on back to one of my favorite TV series, Max Headroom, where there was a campaign of terror and it was all over the media and buildings are being blown up and everything. And they finally find the terrorists and they're inside a special effects stage. And all the videos of the bombings and everything were of miniatures. And they said, why are you doing this? And the guy said, well, it's just easier and cheaper to do it in miniatures than actually go out and blow up the real buildings. But as long as the people believed it, they even used that theme in Die Hard, Live Free, I think, Bruce Willis, one of the Die Hard ones about the computer hacking and everything. All right, John on the West Coast, what is on your mind?
We lost him.
Oh, well, gosh darn, he was just there a minute ago. Going to have to start microchipping our callers so we don't lose them. All righty, getting on back to Hillary's emails. More and more information is coming on out. As you know, Judicial Watch keeps finding more emails that should have been turned over by Hillary Clinton and were not. She lied, she lied, she lied, she lied under oath. Why is nothing being done about that? And one of the emails does confirm something that we have been saying all along. The reason Muammar Gaddafi was killed was to stop the Libyan gold dinar and to gain control over the Libyan oil reserves, in particular what currency they would be traded for. That's what this is really all about. All of this war and bloodshed and risk to the planet itself, a nuclear extinction level event, is an argument over whose brand of ink and paper we will all be enslaved to for the next 100 years. Now, there's a very enlightening article over here in Washington's blog about why the Washington Post is so positive over the U.S. intelligence agencies. The Washington Post never says anything bad about them anymore. Far cry from the days of the Watergate investigation. And, of course, the reason is because Jeff Bezos, who runs Amazon, bought the Washington Post and is molding the Post's editorial policy. And Amazon, in turn, has been working with the CIA since 2014 to provide the agency's cloud computing needs and apparently is now expanding to other American intelligence agencies. So, yeah, the Washington Post is absolutely useless in finding out what the government is really about. Because its owner, Jeff Bezos, is all buddy-buddy with the intelligence agencies. You're never going to get the truth out of them. By the way, another revelation here, that the New York Times and the Washington Post have been busted buying clicks from China. Their China traffic jumped from 5.1 to 49.2% of all site traffic in just 2 months period, trying to boost the illusion of a readership. And by the way, by doing so, they're defrauding their advertisers. Just something to keep in mind. All right, we're going to take another break for commercials. We'll be back after these few words. Stay tuned. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to take another phone call. Then we're going to close the lines for a while because I got some news to get through. Bob in Princeton, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to put the things in historical terms. Can you kind of talk about the abuse that Donald Trump is getting in relationship to the abuse that Jimmy Carter got and the flack that way back when Richard Nixon got, when it was 24/7 attacking him? And even though there's the Watergate situation we can talk about, there was a hatred for him being a part of the House Un-American Affairs activities, and I guess the left never forgave him for that, even though some of the things he did were more progressive than any other Democrats that came along. So could you kind of talk about those two other presidents and how the current attack on Mr. Trump kind of exposes the deep state in all three of those occasions?
Well, I would agree in terms of the deep state for Donald Trump and Jimmy Carter. The difference with Richard Nixon is that he was an experienced politician. And he knew what he was getting into the White House. The common thread between Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump is they were truly outsiders. And they came on into Washington, D.C. politics with a lot of false assumptions and unrealistic expectations, and they got blindsided by it. As far as Richard Nixon, there were a lot of people. I mean, anytime you have a president coming into the Washington, D.C. environment, there's going to be opposition, especially from the opposition party. So there's always that to some kind of a degree. The opposition to Richard Nixon was that he did have a reputation for corruption, not on the scale of the Clintons, obviously. If you're my age, you remember the Checkers speech and so forth. And there was just that, a lot of people just didn't like him on a gut level. And I didn't either. I actually met him when I was a kid because I was living with my grandparents in East Concord, New Hampshire. And my grandfather was very big in New Hampshire GOP politics. And Nixon had just lost to Kennedy. And he was up there working with New Hampshire's Senator Styles Bridges, who was going to run for Congress. And after he was done with Bridges, Nixon would come on over to my grandparents' house, and my grandmother and mother would immediately leave for the bingo parlor because they knew what was going to happen. Walt and Dick, we're going to get blasted on Wild Turkey and spend the night bitching about them damn Kennedy boys. But I remember, as young as I was, I just had an instant dislike for the guy. But you're absolutely right. Nixon's role on the House Un-American Committee, the whole McCarthy situation, left a very bitter taste, not just with the left, but with everybody who understood that it had been a totally unjustified destruction of innocent people's lives. And they weren't sure they wanted that kind of a personality willing to do something like that in the White House. But again, following Watergate, there were researchers who went on back and found indications that Richard Nixon had been cheating during his first election. So, again, Nixon deserved a lot of what he got. Jimmy Carter did not. Trump does not. And Trump is, like I said, he's got to take off the gloves and put on the presidential brass knuckles. Thanks for the call, Bob. We've got to take a break for station identification. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. We've closed the phone lines because I want to get some news here before the lovely Lady Claire joins us. So we're getting back to the war zones here. And over in Syria, this article headline may be a little optimistic. This is over in fourthmedia.org. And they're saying the end of the war is now in sight. And their rationale is very simple. When the U.S. forces over there on the southeastern part of Syria were planning to move to take control of Al-Tanf, which would give them a bridgehead, if you were, to move toward the Euphrates River and capture and control the whole southeast of Syria. But Syria made an unexpected end run, shot through to the Iraq border. They've got them boxed on in. And so all of these U.S. forces, they're basically, they're hamstrung. Now, of course, as you know, as the Syrian forces got close to the U.S. attacked them, claiming it was self-defense. But again, that's a ridiculous claim to make because those U.S. forces are in Syria without the permission of the Syrian government. Technically, it's an act of war. It's an invasion. And if you march an army into somebody else's country, sooner or later, their army's going to come on over and say, excuse me, what are you doing here? And again, we're getting closer and closer to the possibility of direct conflict between U.S. forces and Syrian government forces, which would really put an end to this idea that the U.S. is there to get ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and runs the risk of conflict with Russia. And nobody wants that. Or at least I hope nobody. Well, actually, no. Lindsey Graham wants that. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. Another article that's coming out of 21st Century Wire. The British and the American presence is directly escalating that conflict near Al-Tanf. And that is why I think that other headline was prematurely optimistic, because the U.S. has now been inside Syria for more than 5 years, trying to get rid of Bashar al-Assad and put in a Western-friendly puppet regime. They're not going to quit after all this time, all this money. And when you're looking at the larger view of a series of ongoing wars to bring the rest of the world under U.S. domination, you need to understand your first defeat is your last, because at that point the agenda falls apart. Everybody realizes that the invincible U.S. military is vincible. The Soviet Union had the same thing happen to them in Afghanistan. It was following their loss in Afghanistan that the Soviet Union started falling apart. Now, a lot of people are very, very concerned about the fact that the U.S. is deploying these high-mobility artillery rocket systems moved from Jordan to Syria. These are an updated version of what used to be called the MLRS, the mobile, the MRLS, the Mobile Rocket Launching System. It's kind of a sort of a shotgun. It's this big box with multiple missiles that can be fired, and these have a very long range. These are able to directly engage the Syrian government forces in southeastern Syria. They are not effective platforms against a distributed ISIS and Al-Qaeda militia. And so people are very, very concerned that the U.S. is in fact getting ready to go to war directly with Syria's government forces. Meanwhile, Israel is trying to gain their foothold in southern Syria. They basically want to own the Golan Heights. They've been occupying it militarily for quite some time. They're already selling off the oil and gas rights. Syria's oil, Syria's gas, Israel gets the money for it. Now, as you know, the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, is going to send another surge of 4,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. Because, after all, look how wonderfully the last surge worked out. And the surge before that. And the surge before that. Remember the definition of insanity? Now, once again, we're being reassured that these new 4,000 troops in Afghanistan are advisors and trainers. And if you're my age, you remember that's how we got stuck in Vietnam. Oh, they're not combat troops. They're just there to advise the South Vietnamese. Anyway, the escalating situation in Yemen is actually starting to threaten that crucial oil checkpoint. And the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, basically 4 million barrels of oil goes through that strait every single day. And as the violence escalates in the region, there have been recent attacks against merchant shipping. And so a lot of these companies that run these oil tankers are saying, we're not going to go there. Now, there'll likely be a response where the various involved nations are going to send their warships in there to provide an armed escort. We already know that Iran is trying to deploy their warships into the region, and the other Middle Eastern nations are trying to block them, even though that's a violation of international law. If you are in international waters, you have a right of passage. That's just a given. We're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network here. Now, here's where we get onto the situation. Apparently, during the Munich Security Conference last weekend, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham literally came out and said 2017 is going to be a year of kicking Russia in the ass. Okay, Lindsey, here's your rifle. Now, we qualified it to say that they're going to be doing the kicking of the ass in Congress, meaning more sanctions, poke, 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 provoke, 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 until Putin does something that the U.S. government can claim is the initiating event. Secretary of Defense Mattis is out there expressing his shock over the U.S. military's lack of readiness. And he's pointing the finger of blame at Obama, who did, in fact, hold the defense budget down, not as much as the rest of us would like. But the reality is the United States has been at war in multiple countries going back to 2003, actually 15 years. Afghanistan was the first of these wars. We're still in there. And that wears out equipment. It draws down the stockpiles of ammunition and other supplies. And that's the real reason our military is in a poor condition right now. And boy, that $6 trillion that went missing from the Pentagon, boy, that would sure come in handy right now, wouldn't it there, Jimmy? And something else you need to understand, and this is over and above the generally poor quality manufacturing we're seeing in the current generation of weapons. Weapon systems are not designed to last a long time. When they are being designed, there's usually a calculation done that says this is how long this platform will operate before it is destroyed by the enemy. And they work out a statistical average. And then they'll pad that on the far end in case they've got a really good crew or a really good pilot. And that's basically where they say, this is where it's going to become obsolete. It's like planned obsolescence for your cars. High-end cars are designed to wear out after 8 years. Low-end cars, 5 years. Military hardware, much shorter than that. And that's one of the reasons they're always needing parts to be replaced, because it's all wearing out. One of the problems that the Blue Angels have been facing recently is that their particular version of the F-18 was basically went out of production years ago, and they're having trouble finding parts for that particular configuration. And that's another reason why I think it's a bad idea to try and get into a war with a military peer like Russia and China, because they haven't spent the last 15 years burning up their weapons, burning up their supplies. They spent the last 15 years building and stockpiling. Now, apparently, Turkey's Erdogan is very angry at the United States government that has issued arrest warrants for bodyguards, for 12 of his bodyguards, following this little brawl at Turkey's Washington embassy during Erdogan's visit to the U.S. last May. And basically, the bodyguards were responding to a ruckus in front of the embassy, and now the U.S. is expressing its displeasure for Turkey siding with Qatar by saying they want to arrest those bodyguards now. Good luck serving a warrant over there in Ankara, I think. Over in Iran, a senior advisor to the supreme leader of Iran is basically saying this new set of sanctions against Tehran, approved by the Senate, is a breach of the spirit and the letter of the P5+1 deal reached between Iran and 6 major powers in 2015. Because, again, that deal was about Iran's nuclear work. And it was a sweet deal for Iran because, as it turns out, they weren't actually building nuclear weapons. They gave it something that didn't exist in exchange for a lifting of sanctions. And the U.S., as usual, is ignoring their obligations under this agreement, and they're imposing more sanctions. Why? Well, because Iran is working with defensive short-range missiles. They're not allowed to defend themselves from our coming invasion. Every nation, every individual, has an inherent right to self-defense. Nobody's going to argue with that. Nobody's going to get up there and say that this nation or this person should not be allowed to have the means to defend themselves when attacked. I'm sure much of those GOP baseball players would agree with me about that right now. But that's what the U.S. is trying to do in Iran and North Korea, is say you're not allowed to have weapons to shoot at us when we invade your country. Doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. Over in Greece, and those poor people, they're in so much trouble economically, but apparently there's another ruckus going on. Apparently an 11-year-old boy was killed by a member of the Roma community, the Gypsies. And apparently the community is demanding the eviction of the Romas from their community, and apparently the Greek police showed on up, and there's tear gas and more violence. It just feels like the whole world is just on an edge right now. This is where it's getting really weird. The United States is threatening to replace the United Nations Human Rights Council unless they stop criticizing Israel. I don't think the United States actually has the authority under the United Nations Charter to do that, but that's what they're asking for. Meanwhile, Israel's activists are now demanding Holocaust education be mandatory in Scottish schools. Let's get them brainwashed and believing before they get onto that internet and find out that the whole thing may be just another fairy tale. China is demanding an on-site inspection of the 2 operating terminal high-altitude area defense batteries that are currently operating in South Korea. China is asking this out of concern because the THAAD has an extraordinarily powerful radar which China believes is able to peer into China itself and spy on their military maneuvers, and they want reassurance and an inspection that the radars are not, in fact, proving a risk to China's internal security. And I think China has a legitimate issue here, and I don't think there's a snowball's chance in the dark regions the U.S. will ever go along with it. Now, we have been talking about the poor quality of America's weapons, and we know about the F-22 asphyxiating its pilots. Now the F-35 has got hypoxia issues. More and more pilots are coming forward about that. Now it turns out apparently the F-A-18 fighter jet oxygen systems have a problem that has resulted in the deaths of 4 U.S. Navy pilots. And we're getting this song and dance from the Pentagon that these oxygen systems are very complicated and they're very deep inside the plane and it's not easy to replace them or up. What are you going to do? Have the pilots black out in the middle of a conflict? When you're doing dogfighting is when you most need that oxygen, because those high G turns are pulling the blood away from your brain. You need every little bit of oxygen you can get. This is a major, major problem. And it's probably a lot more that they're covering up. Remember when the F-16 first came on out? There were wiring harness problems. During high G turns, the wiring harness would abrade against the internal fuselage and then short out. Caused a lot of crashes, killed a few pilots. Tried to keep it hushed up. There was a lawsuit by the widow of one of the pilots that finally found the evidence that, yes, they knew there was a problem with the wiring harness. They were covering it up. They weren't doing anything about it. Now then, getting on over to the Gerald R. Ford, which was praised by President Donald Trump and officially delivered to the Navy on May 31st with fanfare, is still being dogged by all kinds of problems, including the fundamental function of an aircraft carrier launching jets from its deck and catching them when they land. And apparently the landing system that captures the jet, you know, the wire arresters on the good old-fashioned, reliable, we know it works aircraft carriers, basically the cable comes off a big spool and there's a big brake that slows it down. And you set the degree of pressure on the brake based on the weight of the aircraft that's coming on in. But the Gerald R. Ford apparently has a magnetic braking system that's got issues. And apparently the original estimate for the arrestor system for the Ford was $301 million. It ballooned to $961 million, just under $1 billion, according to Bloomberg News. And apparently there are still problems with that magnetic rail catapult, where it's still not cleared to launch the FA-18 jets carrying a full complement of fuel tanks under their wings, which is a serious handicap. It limits their combat range. Now, the FA and FA-18 stands for Fighter Attack. It's another multi-role aircraft. And in its fighter role, it's supposed to provide cap over the aircraft carrier battle group. And if it can't carry as much fuel as it's supposed to, it can't travel as far, it can't stay in the air as long. This is really a huge embarrassment. All right, so let's talk about the economic news here a little bit. There is speculation that Illinois may be the first state in the country to file for bankruptcy. We've heard cities filing for bankruptcy and all the rest of it. Now we're talking an entire state. They're not the only one. There's actually been a lot of talk here in Hawaii about the state having to declare bankruptcy. A big part of it having to do with that light rail system. And this morning we just found out there's actually a growing grassroots movement saying it's time to actually audit this rail project and see where all this money has gone, because there's no end in sight. It's just snarled up traffic. It's huge amounts of money. It's a big, big boondoggle. And the reality is a lot of these light rail trains have been built all over the country. Some of them do work. Some of them don't. There was one project, it ran into something like billions of dollars, and nobody uses it. It doesn't go anywhere that anybody wants to go. Now, the other day we ran this flashback story from 2015 where the Illinois lottery started capping the winnings. If you played the lottery and you won more than $600, you didn't get the money. You got an IOU that Illinois promised they would pay off somewhere down the road. And apparently two of the big national lotteries, Powerball and Mega Millions, are now closing down operations in Illinois due to their budget crisis. Probably the reality is people aren't buying lottery tickets there. They don't have the money. So, Germany's Angela Merkel is out there on the warpath against these planned U.S. sanctions on Russia, saying it's going to hurt European companies. And their economy is not very resilient. No more resilient than that here in the United States of America. This could actually put companies out of business. So this is not getting a very warm reception all over Europe. And it could actually harm relations between the U.S. government and the European Union. Certainly some of the member states, like Germany and Austria, who are both opposed to this and saying, this is going to cause us all kinds of problems. Just so you can flip Putin the bird? This is ridiculous. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And speaking of the poor quality of the U.S. military, we're just now getting a report that an Arleigh Burke guided missile destroyer, the USS Fitzgerald, has collided with a merchant vessel 56 nautical miles southwest of Yokosuka, Japan. Apparently some of the crew on the U.S. ship are injured, and the Navy has requested the help of the Japanese Coast Guard. Now, I actually got to tour one of the Arleigh Burkes, and I've been on the bridge. And if you actually look out the windows, you can see what you're heading toward. And they do have those radars. I remember I was working down in Honolulu during that tragic incident where the USS Greenville, a U.S. submarine, was out there with one of these, you know, take a bunch of bigwigs out and give them the thrill of being on a submarine, and we're going to do an emergency surface and look really impressive. And they hit and sank this Japanese fishing teaching ship, the Himemaru, and killed a bunch of those kids. Boy, oh boy. All righty, let's get on back to the news here. We're talking about the economic news. We were talking about the pension crisis, and it is widespread, and it doesn't look like there's a solution. General Electric has a $31 billion pension problem, the largest of any other U.S. corporation. And we know what's going to happen. Congress will pass a law that says it's legal for these pensions to cut off payments. If they don't have it, they don't have it. And the reason these pensions are in so much trouble is under the law, pension funds, whether public or private, are only allowed to invest in investment products that are rated AAA. And back in 2006, 2007, Wall Street's pet rating agencies were giving AAA ratings to all those mortgage-backed securities that turned out to be fraudulent. In some cases, these bundlers were pledging the same mortgage over and over into different mortgage bundles. That's felony fraud right there, and nobody went to jail for it. So because of the AAA ratings, pension funds were investing in these. There was a hot item. That's why there was so much fraud going on. Everybody wanted these things. And the fraud collapsed, and all the pensions took a bath. And certainly nobody in the corporate media has the gonadal tissue to stand up and point the finger of blame where it really belongs. Wall Street and their culture of fraud. Instead, it's all, well, you know, people are living too long, they should work later, they're expecting too much from the pensions, really, they've got Social Security anyway, which is also another lie. Okay. Have to deal with that later. Now, as far as our current stock market, the tech bubble seems to be deflating, if not bursting. Prices of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple are headed down again. This despite Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods, which in turn has triggered a decline in various other supermarket chain stock prices. And Amazon just wants, they want it all. We're going to get it all. We own the Washington Post. We're going to buy Whole Foods. Now, Aiea, which was this advanced battery startup funded by Bill Gates and Kleiner Perkins, is now bankrupt. And what's amazing is they had to declare bankruptcy right after receiving an award from the Clean Tech Group for North American Company of the Year. And apparently they have found a buyer for the patent for the technology, which is based on salt water. And but they just went. All of these alternative experimental energy companies get into trouble. Now, maybe it was just bad management. Very often, a lot of these tech startups are being done by people who don't really have a good business sense. And we hear these stories about huge salaries and luxury travel and way too little for research and development. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. We're talking about the economic news here. And retail sales just got done this last month, tumbling the most since January of 2016. And apparently gasoline is dropping. People just don't have any place to go. They don't have jobs, no money to go shopping. Electronic sales are slumping. That's probably a reason why we're seeing these tech stocks decline. The old business model of planned obsolescence, where everybody gets a new cell phone every 3 years, a new tablet every 3 years, new computer every 5 years, it doesn't work any longer. People are hanging on to their devices as long as they possibly can. And it's time for a serious rethink, or these companies are just going to go on out of business. J. Crew reports its 11th consecutive quarter of same-store sales declines. In other words, they're tracking sales not as an aggregate total, but on a store-by-store basis. And just looking at the individual stores, they've had 11 months of continuing declines. Over in the realm of Obamacare, which the Democrats are still clinging to with love and affection, because it's got his name on it. Apparently, and we knew this was coming, health insurance companies who are part of Obamacare, like Blue Cross Blue Shield, Connecticut, various other, they're requesting premium increases of 20% or higher for fiscal year 2018. So the Affordable Care Act was anything but affordable. Sky-high insurance premiums, sky-high deductibles, and the medical industrial complex isn't helping things, because a study done of more than 2,700 U.S. hospitals show that emergency rooms charge a markup of 340% more than what Medicare will actually reimburse. This is according to a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Now, somebody sent me a chart the other day showing that one of the reasons why the cost of medical care is going through the roof are the administrators. And it was simply a graph of the number of doctors practicing in the United States versus the number of medical administrators working for all these various companies and subcontractors and sub-subcontractors and so forth. And the chart for the doctors was growing at a steady rate, and the chart for the administrators just went right through the roof. And part of that, again, goes back to Obamacare, which basically mandated all these additional people to take care of all the paperwork and try and keep track of it. These days, your average doctor spends as much time filling out forms as they do seeing an actual patient. Now, over at the University of Wisconsin, there's a very popular professor, Eric Olin Wright. He's very popular with the liberals, and he teaches a course that basically bashes capitalism. Capitalism is bad. Capitalism is bad. And little bit of an embarrassment came on out. He's getting an annual salary of $170,000, which puts him in the top 2%. But capitalism is bad. Boy, oh boy. Okay. Now, over in Great Britain, as you know, Theresa May is still struggling with the aftermath of her serious misgamble on the recent election. She's trying to form some kind of a coalition to give herself a majority in Parliament. Jeremy Corbyn is trying to build his own coalition to try and take the prime ministership away from her. And Theresa May is basically dealing with this party out of Ireland called the DUP. And there's a new wrinkle on that one because the DUP is backing a hard Brexit. They don't want negotiations. They don't want a deal. They don't want any of this stuff. They just want out now. And so that whole coalition deal may fall apart, and that's going to leave Theresa in a very, very vulnerable position. Meanwhile, as Brussels continues to talk about a divorce payment or this or that, a British member of the Parliament basically came on out and said the European Union only exists today because of all the money they've already gotten from Great Britain. That the EU only exists because of Great Britain. And their issue is apparently how Brussels wasted tax money, and apparently they did a lot of that. But then show me a government that hasn't wasted tax money, especially our own. Now, apparently Spain is out there saying something has to be done to prevent any more Brexits. If just one more country leaves the European Union, or even starts to leave the European Union, the whole thing will come apart. And we already have countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic are already talking about leaving over the refugee crisis. And they're in serious trouble. And here's where the wrinkle comes on in. Political scientist Rostislav Ishchenko is out there putting out this idea that the European Union could become prosperous by ignoring all these Russian sanctions, pivoting to Russia, and just going back to peace through commerce. Remember, before all these sanctions were put in there, much of Europe did business with Russia. Russia bought a lot of agricultural produce, things like cheese, wine, everything from Europe. And that all got cut off, and that's one of the reasons why the EU is in economic trouble. All these sanctions are strangling the global economy. And I'm sure there are probably a lot of people in the European Union thinking right now that their relationship, the special relationship with the American government, has hit its sell-by date. And that it may be time to just say, you guys, you can't even run your own country properly. We're not going to listen to you tell us how to run ours. And they're going to pivot toward Russia. Now let's talk about that disastrous tower fire. This is going to turn out to be a big, big stink. And again, the anger has to do with the choice of the cladding that was on the buildings, which is apparently a thin aluminum cladding that carried an insulation layer of this polystyrene material that is highly flammable. And people are now becoming very upset because it turns out this kind of material is actually illegal to use in the United States. You're not allowed to use this because it is a fire hazard. Apparently somebody actually did a test on this material. They applied heat to it for just 2 minutes and it burst into flame. Now experts were warning this council not to use this material because it is dangerous. It's known to be dangerous. It's illegal here in the United States. But apparently the original Grenfell Tower contractor who was going to use a safer material was dropped so the council could save 1.6 million pounds off the cost of the refurbishment project. It was all done for money. All those people are dead to save a few pennies. Remember what I said about Fukushima or Hanford or the Deepwater Horizon or any of these things? You cannot leave the safety decisions in the hands of the money junkies. And the people are very angry. Apparently protesters literally stormed the Kensington Town Hall, screaming that somebody has to be held to account. And here's where it gets scary. The Grenfell Tower cladding was cheaper, more flammable version of the two options. And apparently 87 more tower blocks in Great Britain are covered with the same material. So residents are already out there saying, we don't know whether to stay or get the heck out. People are posting signs saying, you need to be aware. This building is covered with the same material that caused the disaster at Grenfell. And what really makes this scary is if there are any arsonists, firebugs, people on antidepressants who are looking for a cheap thrill, they now understand it's not going to take very much effort to get these buildings to go on up. Frankly, that stuff needs to be immediately removed from those buildings and replaced. Jeremy Corbyn is out there saying that empty luxury properties been seized for non-payment of taxes or foreclosed on ought to be opened up to the people made homeless by the Grenfell fire. Something needs to be done. Okay. Now let's get into the world of political correctness. We talked about this before, where all of a sudden these supposed transgender boys who, in their mind, they say, I'm a girl, and they're being allowed to compete in girls' sports. And it is ridiculous, and it is silly, and to nobody's surprise, these boys are obviously outclassing the girls. Now, of course, the feminists are up in arms. How dare you say that girls are weaker than boys? Well, I'm sorry, but that is the reality. That's the biological reality. You know, we evolved to be the big, hulking brutes so we could go out and slay a mammoth and bring it on home for the wife to cook. But somebody wrote a really good analysis of this. This is over in Natural News. And I want to read this to you verbatim because it tells you where the real hurt is coming from this. It says, imagine this. Your daughter has been training and running track for 4 years. She's a senior, and she's made it to the state finals. College recruiters are in the stands, and this is her day to shine and possibly get a scholarship so you don't have to go bankrupt trying to fund her education. Except that doesn't happen for her because a boy, claiming to be a girl, handily steals the title from her. She's devastated, but when asked how she feels about it, she's terrified to be truthful, that she rightly feels she was robbed by someone who shouldn't have been competing against her. And I'm totally in agreement. I don't care what you want to imagine you are what you are. You can have the surgery, you can have the hormones, you can have all the rest of it. When your DNA is tested, you are the gender you were born with. If you test Caitlyn Jenner's DNA, it's going to come back, this is a guy. And that same DNA is going to give the guy who thinks he's a girl additional muscle mass and density. And it is an unfair competition. And it should not be allowed to happen. It's ridiculous. This whole gender fluidity nonsense. It's another attack on our sense of self, our sense of identity. You know, for all the talk about diversity, that's not what they really want. They want us all completely confused about who we are. One uniform mass of totally messed up, unable to think, unable to know who we are, slaves. That's it, basically. Oregon has now become the first state to add a third gender to the driver's licenses. It's M and F, and I guess it's a question mark. I'm sorry? It's an X, which I have no idea what that means or is supposed to. And I don't care. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Now, over in the world of computers, as you know, there's a lot of work going into artificial intelligence, and it's developing some very bizarre results. Over at Facebook, they're working on their artificial intelligence lab, and they've created what are called chatbots, which are, you know, an outgrowth of all these personal home assistants that can carry on conversations with you. And in order to speed up the development, they have 2 of them that are talking to each other. And over time, they noticed the chatbots started inventing new words for things. And after a while, they were having communications between themselves using the new words, like a new language, and less use of English. I think the chatbots were cursing out the programmers because they were smiling when they did it. Even more interesting, the chatbots are supposed to be able to carry out negotiations and make deals, and they discovered the chatbots have learned how to lie and cheat to get what they want. Boy, oh boy, send them to Washington, D.C. Members of Congress, they all talk in their own language anyway. They all lie, cheat, and steal. Let's replace them all with computers. And then pour salt water into the top. Yet another piece of malware has been detected out in the wild. And apparently this new one is called Sorbrecht, and it's being described as a fileless ransomware which injects malicious code into a legitimate system process on a targeted system and then deletes itself from the disk in order to evade detection. This one is aimed at enterprises, servers, and endpoints. It's aimed at companies rather than individuals. And where is the NSA and the CIA and the FBI and the U.S. government? Can't be found. You call the FBI and say, I've been hit with ransomware, what are you going to do about it? And the FBI says, oh, you got to pay the ransom. Starting to wonder if maybe the government isn't behind some of this ransomware, especially when you look at how much of the ransomware is built using code we know came from the National Security Agency. Now, here's a little bit of a story. Over at the Resorts World Casino in Queens, New York, there was a woman who sat down at the Sphinx slot machine, put in her coin, pulled the handle, and the machine came back and said she had won $43 million, the largest jackpot ever won on slot machines in U.S. history. She snapped a selfie with the screen and sent it out to social media, which is a risky thing to do. And now the casino basically said, we're sorry, there was a computer glitch. You didn't really win the money, but we'll give you a free steak dinner. Now, my question is, how did they know there was a machine malfunction? Could they actually document it? She's suing them, and I think she should. Because there have been other cases where some corporation will make a mistake. They'll have the wrong price on an item in the newspaper, way too low, and people will rush on in and buy it, and the courts have upheld. Yeah, you commit to that, you're stuck with the deal. I think the same thing should apply here. Even more so because it sets a precedent where anytime somebody wins a big jackpot at the casino can renege and saying, oh, we know it was a computer error. You didn't really win that $5,000, but here's a casino necktie that you can have as a souvenir. Not just casinos, corporations. They can cheat you of your money and say, we're sorry, it was a computer glitch. That's a bad, bad precedent. Apparently, a lot of people are concerned over rural America is still not getting high-speed internet. They're still living in the dial-up age. We're going to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back after these few words. Don't join me on the air. The lines are still closed. We're coming up on the lovely Lady Claire. We're still talking about computers here. And today a verdict was handed down in the case of Michelle Carter, 20-year-old, who basically was charged with urging her then-boyfriend to commit suicide 3 years ago. And she was convicted of involuntary manslaughter by a Massachusetts judge who rejected the argument that a recent change to her prescription antidepressant had put her into a mental state where she really wasn't sure what she was doing. And part of the compelling evidence on that was that she continued to text her ex-boyfriend's phone after he was dead. But the judge just rejected that out of hand, got to protect those pharmaceutical companies, and convicted her on involuntary manslaughter. Now, another aspect that has come on out of this is, first of all, this boyfriend appeared to already be suicidal. And he talked about it, and apparently she said, well, stop talking about it and go ahead and do it, and that was basically what they based the charge on. Now, obviously, we all have to take responsibility for what we say, what we text, what we write. Okay? Freedom of speech does not mean you can yell fire in a crowded movie theater and then just laugh at everybody tripping, trying to get to the fire escapes. With that freedom of speech comes a responsibility as to what you say. But I do think the judge was a little too hasty in dismissing the impact of the prescription antidepressants. And again, I want to find out if this shooter in Alexandria, James Hodgkinson, if he was on antidepressants. Because again, it doesn't appear that he ever intended to escape the scene. He literally was reloading while standing up in full view of the Capitol Police. That's apparently when they got the opportunity to shoot him. And these are very, very dangerous drugs. And yesterday, of course, we found all these articles in the British press about how dangerous they are. And you will never see them here in the American corporate media because the American corporate media is heavily dependent on pharmaceutical advertising. And they never say anything bad about our sponsors. By the way, Donald Trump has issued an official order that the government is going to stop working on the Y2K bug. He's only 17 years late, and as it turned out, Y2K was more hype than reality. But apparently there was still on the books a requirement for paperwork by federal agencies that consumed 1,200 man-hours every year to prove that they were dealing with Y2K. So, well, good that Trump finally got around to it, and I'm wondering why his predecessors never bothered. Over in Yosemite, crews are still blasting and burrowing through the snow, trying to open up the Tioga Pass, which is the route that goes out there to the east. It's one of the most scenic. And it is a reminder of this year's humongous snowfall that they're still dealing with that snow. Finally, in the realm of windmills, which are one of the favored solutions to human-caused global warming by the liberals, one of the big issues is where do you store the power when it's not needed until it is? And apparently, large-scale battery storage of wind and solar power doesn't exist. We're going to take a break for station identification. We'll be back with the Lady Claire. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. And for those of you watching on BAM User, this gorgeous creature sitting next to me is the lovely Lady Claire, who will join us on our third hour every Friday with her unique perspective on the world. So what do you want to talk about first?
Well, we have been getting a lot of carping about Russia threat, Russia threat, Russia threat. And today from antiwar.com came a very brilliant article by Justin Raimondo, whose work I respect. And it's called Forget the Russian Threat. Mexico is our real problem. And the reason why that is that the cartels control the southern neighbor. Now, we barely hear a word, Michael, about journalists who are getting into the relationships between the Mexican government and the Mexican cartels, and how the government, areas of government, uses the cartels as banks, literally.
Yes.
And I remember...
Just like the United States with the CIA.
Yeah,
You're not gonna, with the exception of that show that History Channel is getting ready to do about the drug crisis in America, you get very little reporting in the corporate media about how the CIA was tangled up in drug running going back at least to Vietnam.
And this is terrible. I mean, the journalists who are really attempting to do the honorable thing and report on this are getting killed. About 98% of these homicides are going unsolved.
Just like Gary Webb.
Yeah, and please don't get me started on the MS-13.
Yes.
Oh, you know, that is causing terrible troubles. Now, I know that it's Central American, but some of it is in Mexico as well.
And it's here in the United States. It's come on in through those open borders.
Yeah. Also, I find myself more than a little bit annoyed. Not in a way that's going to make me uncivil, mind you, but
this is
annoyed.
radio.
I know, this is radio.
We don't say bad words.
No, we don't. I think them sometimes, but I do not say them. Apparently, speaking to the House Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was asked about whether or not the Trump administration's policy is one of trying to impose regime change on Iran. While Tillerson insisted that the specifics are still being evolved, he did confirm the goal of regime change in Iran. And, you know, I have a double Picard faced-upon moment reading this, because why does there seem to be such huge bloodlust, Mike, on the part of the deep state of the unhinged surveilled states of America to go with war to Russia, which an attack against Iran will almost inevitably lead.
Well, you need to remember the issue with Iran is that Iran refuses private central banking.
Right, I know.
And Iran is a major exporter of oil and refuses to sell it only for the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
And that, of course, was the reason for the regime change in both Iraq and Libya.
Yeah.
Again, it's all about whose brand of ink and paper we're all going to be slaves to.
Yeah. And there's also the other issue of what's on Israel's to-do list for the United States, mind you. Israel wants to see Iran regime changed, but constantly insists that this only happen through the shedding of American blood and American money.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There was a comment by the Russian Defense Ministry, and you touched on this a little earlier today, that the U.S. may attack Syrian troops with multiple rocket launchers because they have been moved from Jordan to the military base, which is an illegal military base, near the city of Al-Tanf, 18 kilometers from the Jordanian border. And according to the Russian Defense Ministry, and they said it in such a coy way, the deployment of any foreign weapons to Syria's territory should be agreed upon with this country's government.
Well, the Syrian government has not agreed with anything belonging to the United States being anywhere inside their territory or flying over their airspace. Again, this is the U.S. acting unilaterally to insert themselves into some other country, and again, this idea that the U.S. is there to fight the war on terror against ISIS and Al-Qaeda is a dodge. They are there to regime change Syria, again, so that Syria's oil is sold only for the U.S. dollar.
And I have to speculate. I don't know what the Vegas odds on this are, but I have to wonder how much longer Vlad Putin is going to allow these attacks to continue. He's been very careful and cautious.
Yes.
But, Michael, isn't there a point with the Russian government and the Russian sense of itself in the world where he is going to feel like he has to act?
There's going to be a point at where that's going to happen. I'm sure that the hardliners in Russia's government are already out there saying, war with the United States is coming. Let's just go ahead and, and crank it up.
Yeah.
Putin, again, he's the only adult in the room of all these world leaders. He was able to defuse Syria over the chemical weapons issue, and the U.S. is still in there trying to get rid of Assad, proving that it really wasn't about the chemical weapons at all.
Never.
It never was. It's about the oil.
I'd like to pop on over to Yemen, which is as close to a complete catastrophe as one can imagine. Yemen cholera toll nears 1,000 as humanity loses out to politics. Oh, do we have a shout-out?
Yes, we're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network, and the melodious voice you are listening to is that of the lovely Lady Claire.
Yes, and I was mentioning that apparently the Yemen cholera toll is nearing 1,000 as humanity loses out to politics. Now, Yemen at this point is a war-devastated, impoverished country. And this gentleman is saying, time is running out to save people who are being killed or being starved, and now you have cholera as well, adding to that complication. This was a quote from Jamie McGoldrick, a UN humanitarian coordinator in Yemen. And he goes on to say, we are struggling because of the lack of resources. We need some action immediately, he said at a press conference in the Jordanian capital. Now, they've updated figures of more than 130,000 suspected cases and 970 deaths, with women and children accounting for half the numbers. Now,
I want to make a comment here.
Yeah.
Knowing that the United States government is already using banned chemical weapons like white phosphorus, it is not beyond reason to wonder if this cholera outbreak is in fact a form of biological warfare.
Weaponized.
And what you need to, first of all, you need to remember the recent history of Yemen. It was about 4 or 5 years ago, there was what was termed a successful intervention in Yemen, where the democratically elected government was brought down and replaced with an installed U.S. puppet regime. And those pesky people of Yemen just decided they wanted to run their own country, and they basically launched a war to kick the puppet regime out. and put their own government back on in. And the United States, using Saudi Arabia as a proxy, is going back into Yemen to slap them down and say, look, once you are conquered, you stay conquered, and you will accept your Western puppet rulers, and you will love them. And that's basically what's going on.
And you have, and I posted this to document it at your website, Mike, Yemeni kids have been killed and maimed for life, courtesy of these Saudi bombings, which are being guided by U.S. information. And because of U.S. assistance for Saudi Arabia in their blockading Yemeni ports, which means food can't get through, you have children dying of malnutrition where this never happened before. Oh, and I wanted to mention that Saudi Arabia is using depleted uranium. This has been documented. And, of course, the use of these weapons is causing a predictable, massive uptick in horrible physical and mental deformities in Yemen's newborns.
And also we know that exposure to it is going to cause cancer, leukemia.
Yeah.
It's a weapon that keeps on killing years after it is used.
I have to kind of sum this up by saying that there is a brutal ugliness in this criminal U.S. and Saudi war of attrition in Yemen, which barely gets whispered about. But I feel I need to say something, and the reason is, in my perspective, Mike, the consequences are all deliberate. It's not that the Saudis don't understand they are killing children. When you kill children, you kill the future of a country.
That's exactly right.
Someone needs to ask the Palestinians about that if they don't believe it.
Yes.
This war is deliberately starving Yemeni children to the point of malnutrition, disease, and death, and deliberately poisoning Yemeni children in the womb with depleted uranium weapons. I feel I must speak out. And President Trump is completely, absolutely, and horrifically on the wrong side of history here. I can't begin to articulate this. His bromance with the Saudi royals on his first foreign trip was a way to push more American weapons on them. It just really made me sick.
And then we turn around and we sell more weapons
to
Qatar. I'm going to turn your pot down so you can clear your throat for a little bit here. Okay, all right.
Okay. And one thing at which I have to kind of wonder and shake my head, that he and the U.S. and Saudi governments are so morally comfortable with this genocide of Yemeni children reminds me of the story of a statement made by the papal legate at the Catholic Church's siege of the Cathars at Montségur. When information reached him that women and children were also in attendance where the guys were holed up, his response was, "Kill them all. God will find his own."
Yes, the U.S. calls it collateral damage.
No child on this planet to me is collateral damage. Not one.
I agree.
Okay, and on a slightly more hopeful note, apparently the United States and China are meeting next Wednesday on North Korea. Diplomatic and defense chiefs will meet for security dialogue, which will focus on curbing North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. And the people who will be involved will be Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, as well as China's top diplomat, State Councilor Yang Jiechi, and General Fang Fenghui, who is the Chief of State of the People's Liberation Army, the U.S. State Department said. And this was part of the framework that was set up by President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping during a summit in Florida in April. Now, I am crossing my fingers that something very concrete comes of these talks, and Mike, I will tell you why. During those talks, Xi requested a 100-day grace period on North Korea to see what he could get done. Now, that grace period is ending very end of this month, beginning of July, and that'll be over. Unfortunately, Kim Jong-un's rhetoric has not softened against the United States, but in fact, over the last several months, appears to be becoming more threatening rather than less. This has not been helpful.
But the same thing could be said about the U.S. rhetoric toward North Korea.
I agree.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, both sides are they're having a genitalia measuring contest on this one.
Yes.
But again, I would love to see a world without nuclear weapons. It is simply not practical because too many people know how to build these things.
Yep.
in terms of North Korea's ICBMs. Again, I maintain that North Korea having nuclear weapons and ICBMs does not guarantee it's just going to haul off and attack somebody, because no nation has attacked another nation with nuclear weapons since the United States nuked Japan. Yeah. The whole point of having nuclear weapons and ICBMs is to deter other nations from invading you. That was certainly the justification for the United States building its nuclear arsenal. You know, you will leave us alone or bad things will happen to you. But the United States has this attitude that we should have the ability to deter other nations from invading us, but no nation should be allowed to have the weaponry to prevent us from invading them. And looking at the recent history of the United States, which is invading country after country after country, regime change after regime change, coup d'etat after coup d'etat, it's very obvious who the aggressor is in this current run-up to a world war. Yeah.
What concerns me is if there is no real resolution with North Korea over its nuclear program at the end of that 100 days, for which Chinese President Xi Jinping asked, we may well be looking again at a war scenario against North Korea. And President Trump may believe that not going ahead with some sort of regional consortium, including South Korea, Japan, and maybe Australia, may cause him to lose face, which is a very critical concept in Asian diplomacy. Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank goodness that Trump is not Asian. But the wild card in all of this, of course, is South Korea's president, Moon Jae-in, who has made it very obvious he wants to tone this all down. He wants to reach across the DMZ and talk to Kim Jong-un. And we don't know what he's doing right now, because through our filtered corporate media, all we're hearing is about Kim Jong-un's alarming rhetoric, which could be as much of a fabrication as when they told us that Ahmadinejad wanted to wipe Israel off the map. We have to always remember that we're working with information fed to us by a corporate media with a track record of lying to us. Remember, I think it was back in March when Mika Brzezinski literally admitted on TV the job of the corporate media is to control what the American people are thinking. And so we always have to be very skeptical. Somebody just came on out and said we should be very, very cautious about news coming from anonymous sources, and they were trying to imply the Internet. But we need to be very cautious about what's coming out of the corporate media, especially with all the recent revelations of how continuously they lie to us and manipulate us. So we're not hearing what Moon Jae-in is trying to do right now. We may be getting, we are getting a very distorted image of Kim Jong-un, as distorted and out of touch with reality as we were getting about Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. So we have to be very, very cautious that we don't jump to conclusions here. But again, if Moon Jae-in is actually opening diplomatic negotiations with North Korea, that's going to put a big monkey wrench into the U.S. plans of going on in there. And again, the agenda of going into North Korea is to bring us closer to a conflict with China, although China prudently and wisely has come down on the side of saying North Korea is out of control. We're going to try and get it going. But I think Xi Jinping's agenda in trying to get North Korea under control is less about saving North Korea from a war as much as it is saving China from a war.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that entirely. And the basketball player who went to visit, that was funny. Dennis Rodman, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Do you know what he brought Kim Jong-un?
What?
The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump.
Yes, I heard that. I heard that. Okay. Well, actually, Kim Jong-un should read that because, I mean, we have seen Donald Trump is implementing a lot of what's in that book. The problem is, again, that book was written in the context of a business environment. And Donald Trump is now in the world of politics, and the rules are very, very different there.
Very different. We go back over to the Clintons, and there has been a Harvard analyst accusing the Clintons of the largest charity fraud in history.
Imagine my shock.
Yes. Wall Street on Parade reports in a 9-page letter dated yesterday and posted on his blog, Ortel calls the Clintons' charity the largest unprosecuted charity fraud ever attempted, and added for good measure that the Clinton Foundation is part of an international charity fraud whose entire cumulative scale, counting inflows and outflows, approaches and may even exceed $100 billion. Let me run with that figure again, folks. $100 billion. We are talking about a lot of Benjamins with that money, measured from 1997 forward. And he says he has 40 potential areas of fraud or wrongdoing that he plans to expose. Now, I've got to tell you this. I would have a little caveat for Mr. Ortel. I hope he is wearing his Kevlar undies these days, doesn't plan on flying in small airplanes, and isn't getting depressed.
Yes, there's a lot of wet work going on here.
Yeah.
You know, we're all talking about Seth Rich and the very obvious indications that it was an assassination. But Seth Rich was just one of 5 people, opponents of the Clintons, or threats to the Clintons, witnesses against them, who all died under strange circumstances in the space of what, 3.5 and 4 weeks,
something like that.
Yeah, it was. They're in the dead bodies list. So go ahead and take a look.
And by the way, where is Hillary Clinton's computer person, Brian Pagliano?
Have not seen him. He may be sleeping with the fishes.
With the fishes, yeah.
Brian Pagliano sleeps with the fishes.
Yeah, that you know, we'll never know. We'll never know.
Time to put his face on a milk carton.
I think that might not be a bad idea.
Yes.
Because people who get too close to the ugly reality of what the Clinton cartel is doing or has done have a tendency to wind up quite dead.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, and I think I'm going to tease this because I know we're almost at a break.
Yeah, we have about 10 seconds.
Okay. Alex Jones gets the jump on Megyn Kelly. This is a funny story. And I think our audience is going to appreciate what this guy did.
And we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And so Claire's got this story about Alex Jones and Megyn Kelly. And Megyn is in trouble. They gave her huge amounts of money. And the show is just tanking.
It's tankorama.
It is.
She is in deep kimchi right now, which for those who don't know is cabbage that is pickled. Very, very favorite here. Alex Jones gets the jump on Megyn Kelly, leaks recordings to set the record straight. After NBC's Megyn Kelly lied to Alex Jones about the scope and purpose of an upcoming Father's Day airing of his sit-down interview for Sunday Night with Megyn Kelly, the InfoWars host set the record straight on Thursday night, preempting Kelly's segment with leaked recordings of their conversations before she could smear Jones on Sunday.
Good for Alex.
And here was
Way to go, Alex.
Here was the setup.
Okay.
As Jones and Kelly began to discuss the details of the NBC interview, Kelly played the part of the earnest lawyer-turned-plucky journalist, batting her eyes and insisting her new show was about profiling interesting people so the public can get to know them better. And Alex didn't take any of that guff. And whatever you may think of Alex Jones, Miss Kelly discovered the following yesterday. She was not going to be allowed to publish ambush journalism against him, as she tried with Vladimir Putin.
I don't know. Was she wearing that same off-the-shoulder dress with the slit up to her belly button?
I don't know, dear. I wasn't really paying attention.
Well, Megyn's in a lot of trouble. Apparently, they gave her something like $15 million on this contract.
Yep.
Her last show lost in the ratings against a rerun of America's Funniest Home Videos.
Yeah.
And of course, the Sandy Hoax people are up in arms for airing any show that calls into question the official story. And yet another sector, of course, is screaming at Megyn Kelly for her perceived legitimization of the independent media. Because in the corporate media's mind, we don't really exist. We're just a fantasy out there that crazy people believe in and subscribe to. And I think it was very good that Alex did get on the show for that very reason. It does help legitimize the independent media. We are a force to be reckoned with. Okay, let me fix this for you.
Sorry.
Oh, just give a girl a mouse and she's a danger.
Thank you.
Okay, there we are.
Thank you. Okay.
But yeah, it does legitimize the independent media, and I'm glad Alex was able to evade the trap, much as Putin was able to.
Yeah.
And Megyn, again, she's trying to ambush journalism, but everybody now knows that's what she's up to.
That's her MO.
And I have a feeling her show is not going to be on the air much longer. NBC wanted controversy, and maybe this whole dust-up with Alex Jones, they're hoping they'll get some viewership for this next episode, but I don't plan on tuning on in. I already know all about Sandy Hoax.
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't find Megan all that interesting to look at either. So I'm going to find something else to do in that time slot.
Yeah. And the one thing that they won't do, and that's so unfortunate with the corporate media, or prostitutes as we call them, is tell America the truth, and that is what
that's
this
not
country's...
their job.
I know,
and
it's
again,
to manage.
Going back to Mika Brzezinski admitted on air, the job of the corporate media is to control what you are thinking. And the job of the independent media is to give you the information so you can decide for yourself.
In other words, with the independent media, we know that you have what my late grandfather used to call the horse sense, or the understanding to take data that you look at and make an intelligent, informed judgment and decision. And that's what I think separates out independent media from corporate.
Well, that's the way it was supposed to work. I mean, Thomas Jefferson used to say the highest duty of any citizen is to keep themselves fully informed so they can make good choices. Unfortunately, sitting in front of a TV, reading a newspaper, or listening to the corporate news radio is not keeping you fully informed.
No.
They are feeding you only what will get you to think what they want you to think. And again, Mika Brzezinski openly admitted that. Our job is to control what people are thinking. And I don't know about you. I don't want to have my brain being controlled by the corporate media, which is probably why I've been doing this as long as I've been doing it.
Right,
okay.
right.
All right, we're coming up here on another commercial break, and we'll be right back after these few words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we get back to the Lady Claire here, story just now coming out over Fox News. Apparently, police have revealed that the Alexandria shooter, James Hodgkinson, apparently had a list on his person of specific Republican politicians' names. The names are not being released, until they can notify these people and not let them get caught by surprise. But apparently, this individual was just targeting Republicans. Period. End of discussion there. All righty. So your next story, please.
Well, it hardly comes as a surprise to me. There was a WikiLeaks dump yesterday, and it confirmed that there has been advanced CIA software infecting Wi-Fi routers for years. Some routers from about 10 manufacturers, including Linksys, D-Link, and Belkin, can now be turned into covert listening posts that allow the CIA to monitor and manipulate incoming and outgoing traffic and infect connected devices.
After the show, I'm firing our router.
Okay.
You traitor.
I'm not surprised here, because in current years, even before the Bush administration in 2001, the unhinged surveillance states of America have morphed from the land of the free and the home of the brave to the land of the surveilled and the home of the cowed in many places. And I think that's a pretty sad situation.
Now, I want to make a point here, okay? When they're talking about what is in the routers, they're talking about what is in the firmware.
Yes.
In other words, what is burned into the router system, which means it's being done with the cooperation of the manufacturers of those routers.
Right.
And apparently, once it's in, there's no way to get it out. It's not like you can do a patch or an update to the software. The firmware is there all the time. And again, it has been a reality ever since the end of World War II. They began to understand encryption was going to become much more complicated. And the lesson of Enigma was it can be very difficult to break, especially if you don't have the methodology. And the idea of backdooring encryption products did not originate with either Obama or Bush or any of those people. The first acknowledged incident of it goes back to a company called Crypto AG. And this was in, I think, the 1970s, 1980s, where this company in Europe was making an updated version based on the Enigma machine. And the owner of the company was paid a huge sum of money by the National Security Agency to put in a back door to their product. And it was a big stink. It was out in the book Puzzle Palace about some of the nefarious things they've been doing. But again, all of this allows the government to spy on the law-abiding citizen and has no effect on real criminals and real terrorists. Just like a gun ban only disarms the law-abiding citizen and won't affect the real criminals and the real terrorists. And we proved that with our NSA challenge. It is trivial to come up with a means of encryption that the NSA is not going to be able to break in any kind of a timely manner. Despite their best cryptanalysts, it is going to take them a very, very long time, if ever, to be able to break these codes. Interesting little piece of trivia. Out in front of the NSA, they had an artist who built this sculpture. Wise use of taxpayer funds, I might add. And the sculpture basically incorporates several messages on it that are written in codes, of which, to my understanding, only one has been solved, and that message was written in a well-known established code system called the Vegenaire encryption, which, by the way, is also very simple, much simpler than the stuff I came up with for the 10,000 Monkeys code. The other messages have never been broken by anybody at the NSA. Supposedly the solutions are in the safe of the director of the NSA for whatever reason. But again, that's why they're pushing all this backdoor stuff and trying to ban encryption. They lost that war. They really did lose that war. And again, if they can't find the ransomware writers and the cyber criminals, they don't stand a chance against a real terrorist group. That's just where it is right now.
Yep. There has been a lawsuit filed accusing a private prison company of illegally funding a Trump super PAC. Now, he's been pretty good for private prison executives, and after the Justice Department announced earlier this year that it would continue using private lockups, which is a complete reversal of an Obama policy announced in 2016, prison companies' stocks soared. Now, a campaign finance watchdog is suing to figure out whether one of these prison companies influenced the Trump administration policy, reversing by donating large sums of money to a pro-Trump super PAC during the 2016 presidential campaign. Mike, this is kind of troubling to me. I'll have to admit it, okay? Prisons, as they are engineered in the United States, and particularly private prisons, just flat don't work. And that is because conceptually they are based on failed, stupid, and broken notions of what prisons are supposed to do, which ultimately cannot possibly prepare former prisoners for returning successfully to the outside world.
Especially an outside world where there are no jobs.
Yeah, yeah. And therefore, the real lack of rehabilitation causes U.S. recidivism to absolutely skyrocket.
What was that Michael Moore movie where...
Where to Invade Next? I was just going to mention that.
All right.
The American penal system has never been quite sure if it wants to punish the prisoner or really get them rehabilitated in such a way that when the person goes back to their lives, hopefully to their families, their kids, their wives, that they're going to be able to turn the corner and not offend again. Now, in this documentary, Where to Invade Next, Michael Moore, and I have kind of a hug and a punch relationship with this guy for a lot of reasons that, if you followed my work on Mike's blog, will be pretty obvious. But he did a segment on a prison, a men's prison in Sweden. And you look at this place, it's like a dorm. The people were treated very humanely. And if you take a look at the relative recidivism between Sweden and the United States, it's apples to kumquats. You know, there's no comparison.
It was amazing to see this place because, Michael Moore's walking around with the warden. There are no guards around them.
Yep.
It's like this little village out there. And they're talking to this other guy who looks like just another ordinary person. And halfway through the interview, Michael Moore finds out that this guy is serving a sentence for murder. And they're all just standing around there. And nobody's worried about there going to be a problem of any kind.
Yeah.
And they do focus on training and getting these people back into their society. This whole prison factory issue is a system that wants to keep prisoners as prisoners, to keep them as effectively slave labor. And again, the problem I have with these slave labor prison factory complexes, first of all, there have been judges that have been caught accepting bribes from these prison companies to send them prisoners with certain job skills that they need. Many of these companies have contracts with the state guaranteeing a minimum number of prisoners there, which is another incentive for cops to go on out and arrest people and give them stiff prison sentences for relatively minor crimes. And the other issue, of course, is that in any area of endeavor these prison factories are engaged in, they are a serious threat to similar activities run by law-abiding citizens, hiring law-abiding citizens, and paying them decent wages and salaries.
And the bottom line is that they can't compete with the prison labor.
They absolutely cannot. And as a result, many legitimate businesses are being driven out of business by this unfair competition. And
the other thing that bothers me so much about this is the school-to-prison freight train.
Yeah, that...
When you've got kids who are maybe having hard times at home, and, you know, once they sentence a kid, a really young, let's say juvenile, to a private prison, that's the kiss of death for that child's future. You know, and I wish that we would move heaven and earth, to get kids out of a bad situation if they're in school and they're having trouble or causing trouble, get them into an environment where they're going to be taken care of better, but not put them into prison, because this stamps a kid for life. And I mean, I cannot tell you the statistics about murder of juveniles in these prisons. It's awful, Mike. It shouldn't be happening.
Not just juveniles.
Yeah.
I mean, considering it's a prison, there's a lot of crime going on in there. A lot of illegal drug use.
Yep.
The guards are bribed and compromised, and it really is. American prisons are starting to be as bad as the one depicted in the movie Midnight Express, the Turkish prison.
Oh boy!
And there's also a hideous problem with contagious diseases being passed around. It's not a good system. And again, I also have a hug and a punch relationship with Michael Moore. But what he showed in Where to Invade Next really dovetails very nicely with HBO's The Newsroom, the debut episode, where the character Will McAvoy is saying, "We're not the greatest nation on earth anymore." And it was one of the most honest moments on American television in decades to come on out and say that. No, we're not the greatest nation on earth. The only greatness we have is the ability to kill more of our fellow human beings than anybody else.
Yeah.
We don't have a great economy. We've abandoned our ability to go out into space. We're trying to get that back right now. Poor quality medical care, poor quality education, and I'm going to go ahead and repost that if it's still available. I think HBO did a copyright takedown on it, and they shouldn't have, because it was a great promo for the show.
The next thing I'd like to talk about is why, after Trump labeling Qatar a source of terrorism and terroristic funding, why America sold military jets to Qatar. Unlike Iran, which has the biggest military in the wider Middle East, the military might of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, for all the money they lavish on arms, is broadly incompetent and incapable.
Well, look how poorly Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen with all their advanced weapons. They're not motivated fighters.
No. The average citizens of the small kingdom of Qatar, let alone the larger Saudi Arabia, are simply not equipped for serious, let alone long-term military combat. So, as we have noted, the United States has just completed a sale of military hardware, including fighter jets, to the pseudo-isolated Qatari government in a deal worth $12 billion, which comes just on the heels of Trump characterizing Qatar as a terrorist-sponsoring state.
Well, terrorism comes and terrorism goes, but when we sell weapons, it's good for the economy.
Yeah, war is good.
And again, these are actually older aircraft. They're F-15s, which are no longer considered, the mainstay of America's Air Force. Although maybe they were a little hasty selling them when you hear about all these problems with the oxygen systems on the F-22, the F-35, and now the F-18.
Oh, those are just really horrible. I'd like to go over to another piece I linked to today, and it was a CBS anchor blaming Trump's tweets for the congressional baseball field shooting. I am not making this up,
I believe
folks.
you. I'm seeing all this nonsense all over the place here.
The guy's name is Scott Pelley from CBS News. Asking the question last night, he said, was the congressional, his English is a little questionable, were the congressional shootings self-inflicted? To prove his case, Pelley didn't cite the endless barrage of violent protests by leftists in the streets or Democratic politicians calling for resistance. Instead, Pelley called into question President Trump's tweets, especially one that said the enemy of America was the media, and that was the millstone from which killers like Hodgkinson drew energy to activate into seditious violence.
That is a bit of a reach when you're out there saying that Trump's criticism of the corporate media is the reason this Democrat went on a shooting rampage.
And I have something that did get me very fired up, and I did a little bit of digging into this guy's background. Sometimes people and things are not quite what they seem. When corporate media does not tell the truth, it becomes the enemy of the American people. And the American people, the American media, has been utterly devious at not telling the truth, although that's becoming a lot harder to do with the rising of the independent media. You can always,
mea culpa.
Yes, mea culpa too in my own little way. You can always count on the corporate prostitutes to do their jobs and regurgitate precisely what the government tells them to. Remember when they told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction as the lie to kick off the war against Iraq? Remember when they told us that Afghanistan had to be invaded because of 9/11 and Osama bin Laden? Those were simply lies spun on a then rather innocent and somewhat gullible country to kick off two horrific wars in which, by the way, we are still participating. SecDef Mathis has just ordered another 4,000 troops for Afghanistan, and heaven only knows what's really happening on the ground in Iraq. The blood and money spent on these wars have been unconscionable and immoral in the extreme. And I found out that Pelley was embedded in Afghanistan for about a decade. And there was an article, A Decade of Reporting from Afghanistan. Now, please remember, CBS is one of the biggest CIA assets ever.
Well, all the networks are.
Yeah.
And it was at CBS where the CIA tried to recruit me, but I had this terrible streak of morality which made me unsuited for employment.
So I have an observation I would like to share with our listeners and readers about Mr. Pelley. So right now, anything he chooses to say about the horrific assassination attempts in Virginia would be immediately tainted and extremely questionable for having been a willing operative for CBS, again, a CIA asset, issuing reports engineered to sell the war in Afghanistan to Americans as a good war, no matter the cost in blood and money. And that gets me angry. I don't think that, he has his right to be able to say, but we at the same time as American citizens, understanding what the guy's background was in Afghanistan, have every right not to believe him.
Well, we don't even need to know his background.
Yeah.
The statement makes no sense. Trump criticizes the media, and that triggers a Democrat to go on a shooting spree. There is no linkage, and everybody listening to that, they're going to say, it doesn't make any sense. It just flat out doesn't make any sense. And it's absurd on the face of it. But they're out there trying to launch this campaign against Trump. And by the way, it's failing. All of the non-corporate media polls are showing that Americans are supporting Trump, that they really do think that all of this Russia bashing and everything is a bunch of nonsense. They're not getting the traction they need to move forward with the war against Russia. CNN had that huge embarrassment where they got together a panel to raise your hand.
Oh, yeah, I remember you talking about that.
And raise your hand if Trump is lying, and it blew up in their faces. We got to take a break for commercials. Back with the last segment of our program after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Last segment of our Pauhana Friday program here, heading into the weekend. Claire, you had another story you wanted to share with us.
Yes, I did, from blacklistednews.com. And the title of the article is When Generals Make Policy from Tactics to Strategy to Political Decision. And it goes on to state that the U.S. has a bit of a problem with the former Marine General Mattis as Secretary of Defense. And the reason is that Mattis is good about thinking tactics, not necessarily about strategy. And
I think that's accurate.
They're talking about this situation in Afghanistan, and allegedly he's going to throw in another 4,000 troops. It makes little sense to send additional troops when one does not know what the strategy is they will have to serve. There is no other way to end the war in Afghanistan other than to simply pull out of it. The racket that the war has become can only be stopped by such a grand strategic decision. Sending troops before deciding on strategy practically guarantees that the choice of a pullout will be excluded from all the evaluated possibilities.
Well, the choice of a pullout is already excluded because of the oil pipeline right-of-way.
Yes.
And the opium poppies.
And the minerals.
And the lithium, especially there. So leaving Afghanistan is not on the cards. If they can't totally conquer the country, they're just going to keep on pouring our young people in there to garrison the place until the oil and opium and lithium and rare earth minerals run on out. Which means we've already been in Afghanistan 15 years. It's long.
I think it's 16, hasn't it?
It's coming up on 16?
16.
I thought it was 15 years on, and no end in sight. We've been in Afghanistan longer than we were in World War I and World War II put together.
Yeah.
And the American people are sick and tired of it. But again, in that larger context of a plan to invade so many countries across the globe, they can't lose anywhere or be seen to lose anywhere because that would derail the whole thing.
Yeah.
And Mattis is doing another surge, but they've done surges before with no results, other than a lot of American kids coming back in coffins and wheelchairs.
Yeah. It does concern me, and also what I'm seeing in terms of the movement of the deep state in the unhinged surveillance states of America, just wanting to go toward a war against Russia and China. And the timing of this right now, Michael, is really lousy, because right now our American military doesn't have the weaponry, the troop strength, the manufacturing, or the money to ensure a positive outcome to such wars.
Well, unfortunately, I think most of the people in Washington, D.C. are caught up in this idea that the U.S. Has never lost a war, which is not accurate, of course.
No.
We certainly didn't win in Vietnam.
No.
We never won in North Korea. And we certainly, contrary to what you see in film and TV shows, we didn't exactly win World War I and World War II all by ourselves.
No, we had help.
In fact, we waited until we saw which side was going to win and then hopped on. Certainly in the ongoing series of wars, we can't exactly declare victory in so many places like Afghanistan. We haven't won there. We haven't really won in Iraq.
Nope.
We are not winning in Syria. We are not winning in Libya. And that is just the reality here. Okay, there's the music. It's time for Claire and I to get on out of here. We got errands to do, things to do, going into the weekend here. Have a really good weekend. We're going to be back here on Monday on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Please stay tuned for John Stadmiller's show, the National Intel Report. Please share everything you learn here with everybody that you know. We still have a chance to derail this rush to a potentially nuclear world war. So have a good weekend. Aloha, America.